Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 6th Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2022-2023 academic year, assessing China's military modernization. I am Victor Stănescu, Chief Financial Officer and Executive Director of Development for the Naval War College Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening on behalf of our CEO, George Lang, for our monthly speaker series, which convenes during the U.S. Naval War College's academic year and is generously underwritten by the estate of Trustee Emerita Barbara and Mr. Herbert Epstein. I would also like to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and sponsors, as well as our staff for their continued support and commitment to the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and the Naval War College Foundation. Enabled and strengthened by our very patriotic and generous foundation members, including many of you, the U.S. Naval War College has continued to advance its many priorities, including research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowed chairs, capital improvement, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional international studies to sustain the college as America's leading institution and standard bearer for professional military education. Now to introduce you to tonight's presenter, U.S. Naval War College Professor Paul Schmitt. Professor Schmitt is assigned to the War Plan Red Team at the U.S. Naval War College, which includes teaching joint military operation within the HELSI Alpha Group, a student advanced research project cohort. His work centers on military operations research, analysis, and wargaming of military issues in the Asia-Pacific region, including net assessments of warfighting balances and future capabilities. Professor Schmitt holds a Master's of Arts degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Naval War College and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Biology and Oceanography from Cornell University, where he received his commission through the Navy ROTC program. He previously served for 16 years as experimentation manager and planner for the Navy Warfare Development Command, and was responsible for examining a portfolio of multiple innovation projects under the Fleet Experimentation and Sea Trail programs. He has led planning and execution across the full spectrum of concept-based experimentation venues, from advanced warfighting fleet battle experiments to war games and concept development workshops. Areas of experiment investigation included undersea warfare, unmanned systems, air and missile defense, Navy integrated fires, electromagnetic maneuver, warfare and information dominance, fleet platform introductions, expeditionary and naval spatial warfare, combat identification, cyber operations, military deception, and signature management. From 1987 to 2008, he served in the Navy Reserve with 3 command tours, as well as joint NATO and major Navy staff tours, including 2 recalls to active duty on the U.S. 6th Fleet staff. He retired from uniformed service in 2008 after 30 years at the rank of captain, with his final assignment as the Deputy Director for Plans, Policy, Resources, and Strategy at the U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Paul Schmitt.
Thank you very much, Victor, and it's a pleasure to be with fellow members this evening. Thanks for taking your time out to join me this evening and give me an opportunity to share a few thoughts on China's military modernization, which has actually even surprised many of us in the War College faculty as to how quickly it has developed. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I think. My views presented here are my own, do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. Navy. After I kind of set the table with some thoughts here, then I'm intending to leave a good amount of time for question and answer in any topic that I may have covered or may be related. So with that, I will move through the presentation. There we go. So the biggest thing to kind of set the table on this is to provide a little bit of historical context for this modernization and this rapid change that we've seen, particularly over probably the last 7 years. A lot of it stems back a very long period of time. Of course, there are many dynasties, but I think the biggest issues have arisen in terms of the way that China looks at the external world because of things that began even with Britain in the First Opium War in 1840. And then from there, all of these alternating periods of stability and chaos, and in particular foreign domination, I think have really shaped the way the Chinese think about this and somewhat why they feel they need the military they have and need to develop and modernize it the way I have. I think the most important idea or the most important thing that they learned from in terms of lessons learned was when the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred and we had Operation Desert Storm, and they saw what we were able to accomplish as a U.S. Armed Forces and being able to build up and set the theater to mobilize as many forces as we did and essentially be right there in the back door in CENTCOM to be able to operate as quickly as we did and with as much massive force and with precision munitions the way we did. And I think they learned from that as a fundamental turning point in the way they thought about their military. Since then, I think most of the change that we've seen has been since Xi Jinping has become the president and is now the paramount leader. He came on board in 2013, just renewed again as another 5-year term, and I'm not sure that that will be his last one. He clearly seems to have some principles and some ideas that he wants to see this work done before he stands down. And he has really set himself up with more power than any other leader that they've had. And that is driving a lot of where the military goes. And then finally, there are some demographic issues in terms of the ethnicity of the Chinese, who seem to not only have said that they have 92% of their population is Han Chinese, some of that because they've actually started to turn some of the minorities around and recharacterize them as Han. There is not a large minority population. There is not a very large population of immigrants. It's very hard to immigrate and become a Chinese citizen. As well as the population demographic shift, which now sets that over 50% of the population is at least my age in the mid to late 60s. And for the first time, their population overall is going down. And in the recent years coming, is going to show about a 17% decline. That's huge when the United States population is increasing because of immigration and other methods. But this is a huge difference that drives a sense of urgency to be able to address some of the unsolved issues that they have in their aspiration for where to be on the world stage. So there is a national obsession with this unity, stability, and control from the way I see it. So what does that mean that they want to do with their military? They've declared that by 2049, they want a world-class military to be able to support their great rejuvenation. So this world-class military, which is more of a concept than specific numbers, is certainly what lays out a goal for this military. But they need to be able to defend, first and foremost, the Chinese Communist Party, and then secondly, the homeland and the populace, so that in fact the CCP has some reason d'etre to be able to continue to rule in an authoritarian manner. They definitely want to assert their sovereignty, protect their core interests. This is not unlike any other country would want to do, but they definitely believe that one of their core interests, which is probably the one clearest red line that they have, is in their mind the reunification, or the unification from our perspective, of Taiwan, if needed coercively, if needed by force, because they have not relinquished any possibility of using force to achieve that end. They believe now that they are going to modernize their armed forces by 2027. That has been one of the numbers or target dates that a number of US leaders have mentioned. And as part of that modernization, they look, flattery is everything here. They look to the United States as a model, and with some Chinese characteristics in it. So a lot of what we see in terms of the modernization is direct derivation from the way that the United States military has built up, to the point that not only do the platforms and some of the capabilities of those platforms look very similar to ours, but now some of the structure in terms of being able to have theater commanders, to do joint operations, to have influence beyond the first island chain, and globally and across all domains, is certainly things that they are pulling from us as to how they define in their mind a world-class military. But fundamentally, one of the biggest things for us is that they are, a number of folks have talked over the years about being able to deny adversaries intervention in their affairs. This is the first military that's been able to actually build truly an anti-Navy and an anti-Air Force. And so that's one of the things that I'll try to bring home as I move forward here. I'm going to first give a nod to my colleague, Professor Andrew Erickson, who was really the first to identify that we are in a decade of maximum strategic danger. And a number of people have picked up on that to say that here we are between now and the early 2030s. This is the most dangerous period. There was a thought that perhaps this was just a window where the Chinese would try to move forward in some of their objectives, but it's clearly, when we put on the right-hand side that 2049 objective of a world-class military, and then look at some of the intermediary objectives that they've recently talked about, to complete modernization of that military, to make it intelligentized, to ensure that we can now incorporate information and mechanization into that military. That was the coming out of the fifth plenum meeting, such that now 2035 was an intermediary objective, but now even more so, a discussion of 2030 and 2027, which has been reflected in some of our own folks that have looked at that. Just a couple of years ago, Admiral Davison, as the previous commander of US Indo-PACOM, had said that he thought 2027 was that action date that the Chinese were working towards. Admiral Aquilino, the current commander, thinks maybe it's closer than that. From more of a political perspective, Dr. Ellie Radner believes that, well, maybe we can make it to the end of this decade without them committing major aggression against Taiwan. And so maybe it's more of a choice if they were to move against Taiwan than out of necessity. But again, it's a core interest. And so if they were forced into a conflict earlier in that, they want to be as ready as possible. And that drives us towards this 2027 or even 2025, which just a couple of weeks ago, General Minahan, the commander of Air Mobility Command, says, I hope I'm wrong, but my gut tells me we're going to be in a fight in 2025. And within our classroom, that's what we try to at least instill in the students, is that sense of urgency of, what if that is the worst case? What if it is 2025? How does that work out? What does conflict look like in that near term? How do things shape up in terms of an assessment of blue capabilities, US versus red Chinese capabilities? So that's why my conclusion is that we're not so much even in Andrew Erickson's decade of maximum strategic danger as much as I think we're in the fit up, the 5-year, window that we're in currently, as to whether or not we can demonstrate the fortitude to make some of the decisions that we need to make to be ready. So, I remember finally growing up, Andre the Giant, and not that I was a huge wrestling fan, professional wrestling fan, but certainly Andre the Giant was one of those guys that, when I was one of those little kids, and you would look up and say, wow, he's almost 10 feet tall. So, are we 10 feet tall to the Chinese? In some regards, we are. But I'm not trying to say that we paint in our classroom that the Chinese are 10 feet tall, because they're not. But they have made significant progress on a number of fronts, and are continually improving and putting more into it to be able to meet some of those objectives that we talked about. A lot of that, which is very stark contrast to some of the things that we're dealing with in our own economy and in our own military, is they have now surpassed us in the size of their Navy. They have had always the largest Coast Guard in the world. They have a huge number of vessels that are now in the maritime militia and have direct connection and tie for command and control to the military. And they are increasingly trying to leverage commercial state-owned enterprises to be able to have dual use, to be able to support a military purpose if they need it. Platforms continue to get turned out. These are new platforms. They're modern platforms with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles and anti-ship ballistic missiles, longer range sensors, both active and passive, and the ability both on land and afloat to be able to use modern electronic warfare and extend their reach beyond our reach, such that, if you were to compare two boxers and you look at that reach number, we are being outsticked in many regards. A lot of that is being driven by the PLA rocket force. They, have now a nuclear triad force. They have built that in the last few years to be credible, to have, as you've seen perhaps in press, a very large silo force that they're starting to fill out. Their silo numbers now exceed our silo numbers for nuclear missiles on land base. And they now have an emerging bomber force that can deliver nuclear weapons. And they are continuing to build out a ballistic missile nuclear submarine force that can also range further, and very soon even further, to be able to achieve targets in the United States, not just on the West Coast or not just to Hawaii and Guam. They recognize this issue of the population demographics, and they've stepped up their recruiting and their conscription to, in particular, focus on STEM people that have special skills and knowledge in the sciences and engineering arenas to be able to fill out their officer corps, and for the first time now start to bring women on board as pilots for some of their combat aircraft. So they're, a couple decades or more behind where we were in this, but they're catching up very quickly. And through their civil military fusion planning, they're now looking at how can we have non-military people contribute to our military effort, not just as civilian civil service folks, but folks that would actually perform the duties that you might normally ascribe to someone in uniform, in particular in areas such as cyber operations. And that's been a point of debate within our own military, but they're starting to make that happen, as well as military sea lift types of activities. So just to give you a little bit of sense of what this looks like, on the left, I've identified just at least a handful of things that are emerging technologies that they are focusing on tremendously, that they're putting a lot of effort into developing, not just one or two prototypes, but multiple prototypes that they're fielding very rapidly to be able to try to achieve their military objectives, and most importantly, deny us the ability to intervene. And so here I've just chosen one area in the graphic of conventional strike capability, where you can see the number of layers of different types of missiles that have different ranges, all the way out to the DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile, which is that yellowish line there. That in the past few years has become a game changer in many of our war games because of that additional reach. And they're not stopping there. There's additional work to go beyond that, both in terms of intermediate range ballistic missiles, but even conventional intercontinental ballistic missiles. So this has been quite an expansion, and this isn't just a handful of missiles. Their inventories have been increasing at a rate that is almost eye-watering, that is very difficult to match within our industrial base and within our budgets. But that's been an important conversation in recent weeks as we've looked at some of our munition stocks in Europe continuing to go down, and the discussions with industry of how quickly can you tool up and produce additional munitions, and how quickly can we take care of backlogs in foreign military sales has become an important point. Some of the concepts that they've looked at sound very similar to the concepts that we have for our military in terms of multi-domain precision warfare. They definitely want to be able to have munitions that can achieve that same kind of precision that we first demonstrated during this Desert Storm, and to be able to expand that to all domains and organizing so that those domains can increasingly work together in a joint manner. They still haven't been able to, it's still kind of nascent to be able to expect them to operate jointly beyond that first island chain. You can see the first blue dotted line is the first island chain through Japan and through the Philippines, but out to the second island chain of Guam and Tinian and the Marianas. They're not there yet, but that looks like that's part of their goal, is to be able to control that area. As I mentioned, they have a military civilian fusion development strategy that increasingly is looking at how can they leverage civilian capability in dual use and in wartime to be able to supplement some of the needs that they have. and they have a fundamental concept of system destruction warfare, which is essentially recognizing that we are relying heavily on networks and communication systems and sensors that share information, and therefore their approach should be, how can they cut us off from that level of networking and communications, and have us rely perhaps only on line of sight and on mission command, which is in fact one of those things that we have a strength in. A number of the folks that are in our classroom, do talk about how we can execute mission command, but it's still a long way to go. There is still a heavy reliance on command control communications, computers, and intelligence systems to be able to do what we do. And the JADC2 concept is in fact reinforcing that, rather than backing away from that and saying, how can we achieve our objectives in the absence of these communications networks if we have degraded comms, if we have degraded network systems? So that's one of my concerns, is are we preparing for the worst case rather than the best case of what we would expect to have in a peacetime environment? So here are some of the advantages that I see that we have right now, but some of these are starting to erode. So in the area of undersea warfare, they've made it a priority since 2015 to essentially build the concept of the undersea Great Wall and have multiple sensors in multiple areas, particularly in the first island, within the first island chain, to try to deny us an advantage in that area, even though we do, particularly with our submarine force, retain a significant advantage for the near future. In air-to-air capability, we still have a significant advantage with our fifth generation fighters, the F-22s, the F-35s, but they are building J-16s and J-20s in numbers, and they are building kill chains to make those fighters even more effective with long range and very long range air-to-air missile systems. I talked about that we have our own strength in the nuclear triad, but they're trying to not necessarily match that, but certainly to be in the ballpark in terms of numbers of silos, increased number of submarines that are available to deploy. That makes our problems that much harder to either deter them or to be able to stop them from using nuclear systems. So the bar for transitioning to nuclear warfare perhaps is lower, but it certainly is one that's more complex than it was before and is getting closer to an even playing field. We still have a significant advantage with the years that we've now spent in building joint capability among the services and in working with a number of partners for combined arms operations. They're really still at the beginning of this and have only been doing this for about 6 or 7 years and still trying to learn that, but they're moving in a positive direction to build capability and to coordinate across the seams of these command and control regions. In space, I still think that we have an advantage in space as well, but with the budgets that they have, they can put more capability and capacity towards this, build this out at an amazing rate in terms of the number of space vehicles that they've been able to now supplement their constellations. And what's changed, in particular over the past few years, is that now what used to be a world that was populated with a very small number of satellites that were school bus size, huge, in fixed orbits within space. Now with the advent of many of the commercial systems and state-owned enterprises that China has, we're seeing more and more commercial capability go up there that makes it so difficult, because these systems are smaller nano and pico satellites and cheaper to put up into space. It's now becoming so populous that the capabilities to counter that space, they may be too numerous and too expensive for either side to completely take that out. So it's a question of, all right, how much ISR capacity do you have, and what degree do you think you can believe in targeting against those systems? That in part is driving towards this interest now in hypersonic weapons, because you may have targeting information for only a short period of time. And if your missiles take hours to arrive at the target and don't have wide enough seekers, then you may not achieve your target. But if you can travel at hypersonic speeds to the target, then you may be able to consummate those engagements with more limited information, or information that may have been available briefly before it was denied. Cyber is certainly a building capability on both sides. I still think that the United States has somewhat of, at least the United States military has somewhat of an edge here, but there is a lot of emphasis that the PRC is putting into this organizationally, and in terms of the philosophy for where they think they want to use cyber capability, both offensively and defensively. And then finally, probably one of our biggest advantages is the fact that we have a network of allies and international partners that would have a like mind for where we are in trying to reinforce our view of what the international order should be, and provide us with basing and logistics. Many of those bases and much of that logistics is now within the reach of some of these longer range missile systems that we've talked about. But the point is, we still have many more allies and partners than China does that they can count on for this. Even though their Belt and Road Initiative is intended to reinforce and to build that partnership some more, and to extend their logistics trains, and to extend the places that they can go, so that they can have more global presence and reach. So here are just a handful of things that I think that we can or should be doing. This all comes back to now the view of what is in our current national guidance and the national defense strategy, national military strategy, a focus on campaigning, not just in one activity, but looking at an entire campaign of activities that across the different levers of power that we have. So here, from the Department of State, from other agencies, from the folks that work on foreign military sales, and then lastly from DoD. These are some of the things that collectively I think we should be working to try to build up. And if we're going to be successful, we need to get started now. We can't be too focused on trying to always think about what should be beyond the POM, what should the organization, what should our Navy after next look like? Yes, we have to work on that. We have to think about what should we have in 20 or 30 or 40 years in terms of our force structure, and what does that environment look like? But given where China is and what their current trajectory is, I'm of the mindset that we need to be focused on what we can do within the next 5 years. So this is what we do in our Halsey Alpha Advanced Research Project. We tried to understand this through wargaming so that we can educate our leaders, but do research and analysis to inform the fleet. Our current game that's getting ready to start is our internal game 54, and it's closely tied to a call for research that came from the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Vice Chairman of JCS. So we're hoping to specifically answer some of those questions with the work that we're going to do this coming term, and to address some of these issues and questions that I have listed here. And we don't know for sure what those outcomes will be, and even one game isn't going to definitively predict what that future will be, but it'll at least highlight perhaps some things that won't work and some things that will work, and that's the focus of our effort. So with that, I'll reserve the rest of the time. So we've got about 25 minutes, and I wish you all a happy President's Day, or George Washington's birthday today. I thought that it was appropriate to pull one of the quotes that he had that kind of expresses my views as we're looking at that. So with that, I turn over to you, Victor, and to the team.
Thank you, Paul, for your thoughtful presentation and informative remarks. Continue work and research in so many critical areas. Ladies and gentlemen, I now open the floor for questions. As mentioned previously, please submit your questions via the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many as possible. Let me try to look at the first question here, Paul. And the first question is, when the US fought in Korea, few of our allies joined in the fight. Why should we believe that NATO or even those nations in the Indo-PACOM will join us?
Sure, thank you. That's a very good question. And certainly in some of the games that we've played, we've even ascribed probabilities that some of our partner nations would join with us, and under what conditions. And since then, we've actually vetted a number of those considerations with folks such as the Indo-PACOM planners, and they've incorporated some of the thinking that we've had into their planning. And we've even used that as to what's the worst case. If you ascribed a 90% chance that one of our closer international partners would in fact fully back us up and provide logistics support and basing and so forth and so on, but there's 10% chance that their government may say, nope, I'm just really not comfortable with this yet. And so you're going to have to get out, because I don't want my people to be attacked. I don't want my country to be attacked, and my soil, even if it's a base that I've allowed you to operate from. So we have looked at those situations, and we've said, okay, if that's the case, can we still achieve our objectives? And in many cases, we've found that we can, but that it requires us to use other facilities where we can, to have much longer lines of communication, particularly air bridges and so forth. So it really stretches us logistically if we cannot rely on some of those partners. But in our discussion, I think there are some that we can count on more than others. And for a large number of the partners that are in that region, they may find this an unpalatable risk to their population and say, hey, I'm out until either I get attacked myself, or until I kind of can see the way this is going. And I don't think that, I don't think that China is going to come out on the winning side of this. So now I'm willing to put myself in and lay a bet down here in the fourth quarter. So your point is well taken, that we should not necessarily depend on all of these allies, although I think that there are a few that we can depend on.
Great, thank you. Next question we have from John Hanley. How much emphasis should we put on defense, military, industrial economics to understand the competition?
Right. So, John, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you in this group. The military industrial complex and the defense economics, to understand the competition. The competition is really on many levels and scales. In fact, it's interesting. I think I'm pretty sure it's an unclassified document that just came out on the 13th of February, which is a joint data note that says, here's how we should deal with competition. And it does talk about how to look at that across the different levers of power, including economics. And so it basically looks at trying to create some balance in that. I think that we have to focus on the economics of that to be able to understand the competition, because the days when John, you and I were junior officers, and so much of the research that was done within DoD lifelines and within DARPA and so forth. That's completely been inverted to the point where most of that basic research is now being done in industry and in academia, and we're trying to borrow from that to the greatest extent possible. So, that's certainly a portfolio issue that the Chief of Naval Research deals with. But I think that, yes, rely on the UARCs and FFRDCs, rely on those universities, those think tanks that we have, and also rely on industry. The only caveat that I would say about industry and that economics is that certainly the Chinese have focused on industry as a weak link for cyber. And so that's why you see that there's a new framework out to try to get industry to match at least some standards so that they can safely transfer their technology and we can employ it in the military.
Perfect. We have a lot of questions. Very interesting. Next one is from John Hooper. Can we get India on our side as an ally, and what are the obstacles and advantages?
Well, I love having India on our side as an ally. They are certainly, from the perspective of other countries that have government systems that align with ours, a more democratic type of country is certainly one that we should embrace. And the Quad has certainly embraced India, and I think that we should continue to work that. India has also done some marvelous things with their military, and in particular with their missile technology. So, and India certainly has national security interests, in particular in the South China Sea and in a collaboration with Vietnam. So having India as another partner there is very good for being able to make sure that excessive sovereignty claims in the South China Sea are not achieved. The Straits of Malacca and the Andamans, and it really has been that India is an important geographic point for some of the things that China wants to do with their Navy and with commerce that have to come through and pass, south of India, and perhaps even try to employ some of the straits and key choke point areas that India has the ability to control. And they've been very good with some of the military systems that we've had in working with, in particular, the P-8 Poseidons. I think that they have a lot that they can contribute. Now, what are the downsides? If you look back at the slide that was on the missile systems, you'll see that most of those missile systems, India is within that weapons engagement zone. They've reached out significantly. In fact, some of those missile systems reach into all of the CENTCOM theater and even briefly into the EUCOM theater. So, you know, certainly from a maritime perspective, they're within the sights. From a land perspective, those additional conflicts that occur and scrimmages that occur on the border are of concern, in that could they in fact, particularly if we had too strong of a relationship with India, would we in fact be pulled into a conflict between India, China, particularly along that northern border? So that would be my concern with India, but I love building the relationship with India.
Great. Next question comes from James Semerad. Can we see from satellite the China capability?
Certainly, we have space-based capability that we rely on for some of our situational awareness. As with all space-based systems, there are limitations to them in terms of what does the orbit look like? What is the sensor package that may be on that satellite? Is it obscured in particular because of environmental conditions? There is a lot of the ocean, in particular inside the first island chain, South China Sea, Strait of Taiwan, East China Sea, that spends about 50% of the time under cloud cover. So, you know, you may not get what you want from some of the electro-optical or infrared systems that you may want to have. Synthetic aperture radars help, but synthetic aperture radars may only be good for telling you how big an object is, particularly if it's a moving object. So that's a better tool to use against something that's stationary. But yes, we can get a lot from space-based systems and that's where I think, again, supplementing what we have in terms of our military space-based capability with additional commercial-based capability is going to be an important aspect of building out that commercial capability that John Hanley referred to.
Thank you. Next question is, what do you think would be the possible outcomes of the meeting between the China and the Russia president in the coming month, April or May?
Yeah. Well, I hope that it is not anything that comes out as additional Chinese support for adding military capability and trying to help them, where in fact they're starting to run low on munitions and other systems. That's a hope, and hope is not always a good strategy. I tend to think that they're going to try not to be too deliberate or too overtly helpful, but will probably try to assist the Russians, at least in some regards. They still don't trust the Russians any more than the Russians trust the Chinese in many regards, but they see a common foe in NATO in the United States. And so I think they're willing to make some agreements just to determine, you know, how can we be a little bit more of a spoiler in this area and reduce US influence and power in the region. So I think they may make some transactional deals on things. I think Russia is likely to say, hey, I've got your back on some of these things if in case the United States wanted to impose too many economic sanctions or even quarantines of various things or distant blockades. I think that Russia would likely be the ones to say, no, I'm not going to allow that, both from a UN Security Council perspective but to what extent they might be able to lend some capability and capacity to ensure that we weren't successful in that. Whether or not there will be a lot of arms transfers, hard for me to say. I think it's going to be partly dependent on cash and barter as to what the Chinese can get out of that. They certainly recognize that they've gone to the Russians in the past, but they've not always gotten a fair deal on some of the things that they've gotten from the Russians. Perhaps the biggest thing that they need from the Russians is better submarine technology and submarine quieting technology. That's an area where the Russians have an ace that they have not been willing to give up to the Chinese, but maybe if the price is right, they'll work on it.
Right, great. Next question is from William Messmer. Says, "Good evening, Paul. Thank you for the presentation. What are your thoughts on the efforts by the U.S. Marine Corps to modernize under Force Design 2030?
Sure. You know, this Commandant has really shook things up more than a lot of previous Commandants. And I admire the fact that he's thought through some of these things and had some good people working on trying to flesh out some of these concepts. I'm not sure that they've got it right yet, but there are a lot of things that I like about the way that he's trying to do this. I think the Marine Corps, the concepts that if you have expeditionary bases and that you can move quickly and remain in clutter in land-based environments, operate from land into the maritime environment the way the Marines had at their roots, and be able to provide lethality from that land-based environment with things like the Nemesis and Naval Strike Missile, and even with the potential of bringing land-based Tomahawks onto HIMARS launchers, both for the Army and for the Marine Corps. There are a number of things that they're trying to build into that new design for 2040 that I think are moving in some of the right direction. My big thing is keep experimenting with those ideas, keep doing workshops, war games, a campaign of experimentation to get it even more right. And the faster you can field things, the better. Again, from a campaigning perspective, be able to demonstrate that some of these systems are adding capability and are adding capacity, so that there are more problems that the Chinese have to deal with from each of the different services. So I applaud the Marine Corps for their work.
Great. Next question: to what degree is there an institutional willingness within the U.S. military to accept a larger degree of mission command when faced with a degraded C2?
Wow, not as much as I'd like, frankly. This is one of those areas that we talk a good game on this, but I don't think that we've made much progress from, you know, this concept of mission command really isn't that new. Certainly it's been written about much more in the last 10 years, but it's not a new concept. You know, as John Hanley and I know, the submarine force dealt with this concept of mission command for years. And I deployed and had mission orders that were locked in a safe that, you know, if in fact we had to execute a deliberate plan, you broke that out and you knew where to go and you knew exactly what you needed to do. And whether or not you had communications connectivity or not, you would have been able to execute the mission. The Marines are a little better at this, and the special warfare community is better at this. But I think most of the general purpose forces, they talk about it, but it's not there yet. And I blame the commanders. I think that if you're a commander and you're expecting your subordinate forces to be able to execute mission command orders, you need to have conversations with those subordinate officers, with your commanding officers, your ships, if you're a task force commander or a fleet commander. I think this is one of the things that Admiral Swift in particular, I think, did well to issue his Swift notes out and to be able to gather his flag officers together and actually talk through some of the problems and what his expectations were so that they had a vision of what that mission command guidance was going to be and would be able to execute. I think that there aren't enough operational commanders that do that with their officers.
Great, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. We'll try to get to at least 2 more questions, but we will also, to all the questions, we have a lot of questions that came in that we didn't get a chance to answer live tonight. We're gonna go ahead and work with Professor Schmitt and try to answer and get the answers to all of you who ask questions. Next question is from Victor Sussman. While the anticipated demographic decline could accelerate the timeline for aggressive action by China, what are the implications for its ability to sustain a world-class military beyond that objective?
Yeah, they're having to be creative to be able to do that. I mean, to some extent, I think they're looking at it not just in isolation, but looking at, okay, what does that mean for some of the folks that are around me? So as bad as it is for China, it's worse for Taiwan and it's worse for Japan. Their demographic decline is accelerating even more. It certainly means that there is more and more of the Chinese economy that now has to deal with how are we going to support this aging population? What are the economic impacts on that? And will that in fact slow down some of this modernization, some of the shipbuilding that we've been talking about, some of the production of some of these weapons? So I think that it perhaps sets up for that acceleration of, hey, this is not only a window of opportunity, but from their perspective, this is a window of urgency that Xi Jinping says, hey, I'm going to be here for another 5 years. I don't know if I'm going to be here more than that. And so I'd like to get this business done. I'd like to get this off my plate. Let's resolve these issues so that we don't have to deal with this anymore. And I think that is what partly is driving this sense of urgency on their part, and in response on our part.
Great. So we'll take the last question, and we'll get all the other questions to you, Professor Schmitt, and we'll get it to our members. The next question is from Stephanie Helm. It seems that our national infrastructure, much of it is private sector, she adds, is vulnerable to cyber attacks, which may impact logistics, communication, and other critical capabilities. To what extent is this home front integrated in your research?
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. Good to hear from you again. In our research, very little, to be honest with you. Because the issue that you bring up, Stephanie, is one that is certainly a strategic concern for our nation and for our military and the roles that we should be playing, particularly from US Cybercom in conjunction with other agencies and other levers of power. So in our games, which are focused at the operational level of a campaign in the Pacific, we have included kind of in the run-up to conflict that there may be cyber actions that are being taken by China that the United States has to defend against, and that different targets are harder or easier to defend against. I've spent a lot of time in the last 3 years, and perhaps the most emphasis in the last 12 months in trying to improve our ability to incorporate cyber warfare into our gaming. It's a very, very difficult problem to incorporate, and I'm working with a number of folks from the Center for Naval Analyses and from the Air Force Research Laboratory to try to figure out how do we introduce this into wargaming. It's a hard problem. I've got an article that may come out as a book chapter sometime in the near future, whenever Georgetown University Press finishes their edits. So I hope to address it in that coming book chapter a little bit more. And I've had some great students in the last year that have done research on this, still pretty much at the operational to tactical level, not at the strategic level, but we're making a lot of progress on it. So it's hard, and thanks, Stephanie, for everything you've done to try to help us work through that from your past career too.
Thank you again, Paul. It's an honor and a privilege to host you this evening. We appreciate you taking the time of your busy schedule to spend it with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, March 22nd, when Dr. Hank Brightman will discuss China and Russia and approaches to delivering humanitarian aid to gain strategic advantage. Updates to this presentation and others can be found on our webpage at nwcfoundation.org under the events section. As always, we seek to expand our membership, individual and corporate, and raise awareness of the great institution which is the U.S. Naval War College, and we invite you to join us in this charge. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you know others who may like to learn more about the U.S. Naval War College and Foundation, please consider giving them a tax-deductible gift of membership so that they can too stay abreast of key issues affecting our national security and democratic way of life. Everything you need to know about joining the Naval War College Foundation or giving a gift of membership can be found on our website under the membership section. Thank you again for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and the Naval War College Foundation. Have a great rest of your evening.